So oftentimes I see Vampire Coast players using this sort of formation, positioning their deckhand mobs directly in front of their handguns. But I do believe that that is suboptimal for Vampire Coast, and I think it does mostly stem from the fact that typically with other factions, you want to be defending your frontline infantry with your ranged infantry. And at the same time, your frontline infantry will be able to defend your ranged by body blocking any melee units that come in. But with Vampire Coast, things are quite different. Your handguns cannot trade effectively with your opponent's ranged units. You can see here that handguns do have 145 range, which is comparable to a lot of other ranged units, but because of their spread, they have a very hard time killing any infantry at the edge of their range, at about here. So if we're not going to use our handguns to defend our front line, we need a different strategy. First of all, we'll usually have mortars in the back line punishing enemy ranged instead of our handguns. And handguns are there to defend against anything trying to get to our back line. Sort of like a second line of infantry to hold off the enemy. Now with that in mind, we're going to instead position our zombie deckhand mobs much more forward. Like we said earlier, the handguns are just a second line of defense to our actual hard hitters. Things like Necrofex Colossi, mortars, and deck gunners. By positioning our zombies up front, they can do their job of defending the handguns better, since if any units try to sneak past them, the handguns will be able to fire in on them. If the deckhand mobs instead were closer, anything that sneaks past them would have very little distance to travel, and our handguns would not be able to fire on them. Now let's look at a larger formation. This time 3 handguns, 2 bombers, and 4 zombie mobs. Now we still have the front line defending our handguns, except this time we have the zombie mobs up front to make sure that our deckhands live much longer. And we also have the handguns defending our front line, except not from archers, we're defending them from cavalry. So a common way to deal with zombie bombers is to send cavalry or infantry in through the side, disrupting them, and then moving in infantry from the front. By positioning our handguns like so, any cavalry that comes in from the flanks will be able to shoot with 2 handgun mobs. This triangular position is especially good because the distance from this gap to any one handgun unit is about the same for the 2 closest handguns. I'd also like to address why we don't keep our front line grouped together like this. It may be tempting to do so, since the bombers are much more protected with our deckhand mobs surrounding them. But the major problem is that we leave heavily open flanks for cavalry to hit our handguns. And after they've hit our handguns, they can then jump on top of the bombers, disrupting them. And then their main anti-infantry troops can come in from the front and kill our deckhand mobs. Better to prevent that from happening by simply spreading out your troops and making it much harder for cavalry to engage. Moving on to a formation using 4 handguns, you can see a similar concept. We've placed our deckhands a nice distance away, but not at the very edge of handgun range. Instead, about halfway to 2/3 of their range, since that is their effective range. Oftentimes you will see some infantry units spilling over the side of the zombie mobs that your handguns will be able to fire upon. So for example, if this mob was engaged, we could turn our handguns like so, and we would have 2 good avenues to fire on the enemy here. Now for our last formation, we're going to look at a build that has 8 lines of defense in the form of zombie mobs. These can be polearms, they can be bombers. As long as you have a healthy amount spread out, it should be fine. Along with 5 handgun mobs and 4 deck gunners. Our handgun mobs are spread out like so, in the same fashion as the formation with 4 handgun mobs, except this time we have 1 in the middle for covering anywhere that it's needed. That way we are able to get 3 handguns firing on any target that comes in. We also see that our 4 deck gunners are positioned in a line as opposed to our handgun mobs. And this is because our deck gunners operate a lot more like traditional range units. They are effective versus enemy archers, and we want them all to be firing on the same archery unit at the same time. So to summarize, we keep our zombie mobs far in front of our handguns, about 2/3 of their range away, to create a nice kill zone between our front line and our secondary front line. Our handgun mobs can turn and fire on any units that manage to sneak by, and since that happens pretty infrequently, the combined fire of multiple handgun mobs will be upon them, which is an easy route. As for units like our deck gunners, they perform a much similar role as to traditional range units in covering our front line and our secondary front line from archer or gunfire. If any of this information was helpful to you and you would like to see more in the future, please click subscribe. If you would like to see me using these builds in action, you can check out the description where you'll find my Twitch stream, where I stream fairly regularly, playing many quick battles, and also where I train with my clanmates.